介石のもとにはおよそ30人のドイツからの軍事顧問団がいました。軍事顧問団のリーダーはドイツ国防軍の将軍アレクサンダー・フォン・ファルケンハウゼン。ドイツ式ヘルメットをかぶり軍事訓練に励む中国軍の兵士たち。ファルケンハウゼンは最新兵器の使い方や戦術を授け、精鋭部隊を育成しました。ファルケンハウゼンが盧溝橋事件の半年前に作成した地図が残されています。
この下の地域、南京、上海、これらの場所ではすでに防御陣地が築かれていたことがこの地図から読み取れます。ファルケンハウゼンは日本軍が上海に上陸するのを予測し待ち構えていたのです。
地図に青く記されているのはすでに完成していた防御陣地です。ファルケンハウゼンは決戦場として想定した上海の西に防御線を引き、首都南京を守る体制を築こうとしていました。
中国北部でいくら戦争しても世界は誰も注目しません。国際都市の上海で戦争をすれば世界中の関心を集め国際世論を喚起できます。
ドイツ軍事顧問団の作戦指導のもとに戦い、国際社会の支持を引き出そうと図る介石。上海での戦いは激戦となりました。
It was Shanghai that the Japanese attacked in 1937.
The Great Battle of Shanghai was fought between August 13th, 1937, and it ended November 25th. It was a horrible battle. They lost eventually because the Japanese were able to outflank them and make a landing at Hangzhou Bay to the south and come around and cut them off.
From Shanghai, the invaders rapidly made their way to the capital. Japanese troops began a rampage of atrocities that has come to be known as the Rape of Nanking.
Capra.
Tonight, I'm going to tell you the real secret.
Was invited to China by Madame Chiang and President Chiang Kai-shek to visit and to observe and see what he could do to help the Chinese to organize the Air Force. That was 1937.
some, there was refuge inside the international settlement, where Japan was afraid to bomb the property and people of the foreign powers. Just yet. But there was not room for all. For each who found safety inside, there were thousands huddled beyond the gates, standing helpless and undefended against the Jap attacks. There was no escape for these surging and panic-stricken people. They could only scurry through the narrow streets, pushing and packing themselves into the center of the city, to be trapped and buried alive in the collapse of bombed and burning buildings. Japanese soldiers went berserk. They raped and tortured. They killed and butchered. In one of the bloodiest massacres of recorded history, they murdered 40,000 men, women, children. Battle of China. This, the great city of Shanghai on a September day in 1937. This, the fearful beginning of a new kind of war. This, the first mass bombing from the air of a helpless civilian population. Why are these innocent Chinese men, women, children to die beneath the hail of Japanese bombs? To find the answer to this question, we must first understand something about China and Japan. And to understand China, three facts must never be forgotten. China is history. China is land. China is east of Shanghai. Reorganizing rapidly, they then launched a coordinated drive on Nanking. One column pushed along the railroad while another swung further to the south. This column then split and continued its drive, hoping to cut off any possible retreat of the Chinese armies defending Nanking. Meantime, at Nanking, Chinese armies valiantly defended their city, which was the capital of the Chinese Republic. Japanese power was too great, and after a battle lasting but a few days, the city fell to the invaders. In their occupation of Nanking, the Japs again outdid themselves in barbarism. The helpless populace was trapped by the city walls and could not flee. The Japanese soldiers went berserk. They raped and tortured. They killed and butchered. In one of the bloodiest massacres of recorded history, they murdered 40,000 men, women, children.
General Xi'an was invited to China by Madame Chiang and President Chiang Kai-shek to visit and to observe and see what he could do to help the Chinese to organize the Air Force. That was 1937, and that was 1937.
July 23, 1937. July 23, 1937. First meeting with Generalissimo. Conference with the world's leading lady. Greatly encouraged by conference with Madam.
In the Huangpu River lie the warships of Britain and America and Japan to protect their nationals in Shanghai. The Japanese ships are the targets for the Chinese bombers, but the American cruiser Augusta was hit by an anti-aircraft shell. Japanese batteries are on the lookout for Chinese planes. Japanese batteries are on the lookout for Chinese planes. Japanese batteries are on the lookout for Chinese planes. And here they come, bombers. British Movietone News records in these first authentic pictures the actual scene at Shanghai as the bombs aimed at the Japanese warships missed their target but burst in the docks. The Cathay Hotel is hit, Shanghai's biggest hotel, crowded with guests, when a huge aerial torpedo strikes it. Another falls on the pavement outside. Death and destruction follow, and a street panic as terrified people rush blindly in the vain search for safety. The bombing of the Cathay Hotel shocked the world, and these pictures have been rushed to the screen by ship and plane to portray with all the vivid truth of an eyewitness the senseless horror of war. And here's a big department store, another catastrophe of the first big battle of Shanghai. It was hit by shell fire in a wild duel of big guns, Chinese and Japanese, in Nanking Road, which runs from the famous Shanghai Bund. Casualties here in the busy center of the shopping district were terrible.
Shanghai is the nation's largest city, with a population of 3.6 million, and is also the center of Chinese commerce, industry, finance, and trade. Shanghai had been the center of foreign settlements established by the Western powers for their interests in China. Those settlements were used as the only safety zones in the country, which was in the middle of a civil war. With that as a background, the Chiang Kai-shek Nanking government had used Shanghai as the source of funding to unify the country. However, the government was manipulated by the Western powers, which were alarmed by Japan's economic penetration. Hence, the Nanking government had adopted anti-Japan policies. It breached treaties and agreements signed with Japan and fueled naive citizens' anti-Japan sentiment and mobilized anti-Japan organizations in an attempt to damage the business activities and lives of Japanese residents. This situation led to the outbreak of the North China Incident. The Nanking government started a series of infringements in North China, resulting in the Japanese army to take security and self-defense measures to prevent further expansion of such events. On his way to the international settlement, First Lieutenant Isao Oyama, head of the Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces, was shot to death when his car was suddenly surrounded by members of the Chinese Peace Prevention Corps, who fired several dozen bullets at Oyama. The spot where he was shot was in the demilitarized zone established under the Shanghai ceasefire agreement. This incident was a well-planned act of provocation against uniformed members of the Imperial Japanese Navy. In all areas of Shanghai, Japanese residents, Chinese people, and other foreigners started to evacuate the danger zones immediately after the news spread. In the meantime, the Japanese military was mobilized as an emergency measure to protect Japanese residents and the nation's interests, but with only a small number of soldiers. Their intent was to seek ways for a negotiated settlement. The Japanese military tightened security against Chinese soldiers dozens of times bigger in size. The Chinese military showered machine gun fire against the Japanese military at 10 a.m. on August 13th. Finally, we had no choice but to fire back to defend ourselves. A little past 9 a.m. the following day, Chinese bombers suddenly flew over the headquarters of the Special Navy Landing Forces and launched an airstrike. Then the Chinese started a formation bombing on the Japanese consulate, military ships, and many of our bases. We fired back as well and drove them off. However, all of Shanghai City was thrown into turmoil as the Chinese military planes launched airstrikes even over the city's demilitarized zones. The Chinese military planes also launched a bombing campaign over the entertainment districts in the city, filled with several thousands of Chinese and foreign civilians. It was reportedly said that 940 people were killed and 1,400 others were injured because of this catastrophic bombing.
My sympathies, of course, were with the Chinese people because of the atrocities that I had seen in our newsreels and so forth that the Japanese had subjected the Chinese people to. And one very impressive picture I saw was this little baby in the railway station, I think, in Shanghai.
あとですね、なぜ日本軍がここを爆撃したかと言いますと、物資の集配所でしたから、この戦略的な攻撃として選んだわけですね。そしてその後にこういうふうになったわけですが、
ここで切っとるわね、この写真は。
これはここで切ってます。
切ってますね。
これを撮影したのは誰だっておっしゃいました。これは王将帝という有名なプロカメラマンです。でしかも国民党宣伝部の映画班撮影部のですね専属プロカメラマンだったんです。そのことがやっと去年分かりました。はい。
Who was Henry Luce?
Well, Henry Luce was the child of American missionaries in China, who, with his best friend in college, Britt Haddon, founded Time magazine. He went on to found Fortune magazine, Sports Illustrated, Life magazine, the March of Time newsreel. Really, perhaps the most important periodical publisher in American history.
You say he was America's single most powerful and innovative mass communicator. Henry Robinson Luce had started distinctive and popular magazines. Taken together, these publications provided a more gripping and coherent view of the world than was to be found in similar periodicals and daily newspapers up until then. He spent a lot of time in China as he was growing up. Why?
Well, his parents were missionaries in China. His father was a Presbyterian minister in North China. Luce was actually born in China, and you know, he and his siblings were raised in a compound in North China, and I believe Luce was about 14 when he actually left China to come to school in the United States.
Did that affect his thinking of the United States and the world?
It did very much. This is a moment, the beginning of the 20th century, when the United States is feeling its oats, is feeling its sense that we are a world power. That was, I think, the major incentive there. As far as the funding, there was a marvelous advantage to going to Yale or Harvard in the early 1920s, and that was it connected you to a lot of families of great wealth. Although Luce and Haddon's families weren't particularly well-to-do, certainly not Luce's, they did have access through their clubs and so forth at Yale to some very wealthy families, and they hit those families up for contributions to start the magazine.
Rival newspaper publishers William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer printed stories about the butcher Wyler. Not out of any democratic zeal, the stories simply bolstered newspaper sales. They tried to outdo each other by printing sensational pictures and stories that fed the hysteria against Spain. Embellished stories like this became known as yellow journalism. In 1897, Remington arrived in Havana to find there were no battles, no cavalry charges, and no artillery barrages. With no story to cover, he wired Hearst.
Everything is quiet. There is no trouble. There will be no war. I wish to return.
Some say Hearst replied, "Please remain. You furnish the pictures, and I will furnish the war." And war did come. On January 25, 1898, the USS Maine steamed into Havana Harbor. Outwardly, its mission was to help quell the conflict between the Cubans and Spanish.
Simply, who was William Randolph Hearst?
William Randolph Hearst was the son of a 49er miner who became a millionaire and one of the country's first women philanthropists. And he began as a newspaper publisher, and by the 30s was the most important media magnate, media mogul in the world. He owned newspapers, magazines, newsreel stations, a movie studio, radio stations, a little radio network, and much, much more.
And was he the first American media mogul?
I think he's the first, yeah. If media mogul means, if we look at what the word means, media is a communications medium. Mediums put their hands on the table and communicate to the living from the dead. Well, media is that communications medium. It's that interface between where a message is coming from and the people who are going to get it. And what Hearst did was Hearst understood right away that once he had gathered the news, once he had written his editorials, once he had his opinions, it made no sense to confine it just to newspapers. Why not put that same news and those same opinions on the radio, in newsreels, in magazines? So in moving out from newspapers to these other media, I think it's fair to say he's the first media mogul.
What did he own?
Gosh. He owned newspapers and major newspapers in New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Boston, every major city in the United States except Philadelphia. He made a deal early with Adolph Ochs, the New York Times, who wanted to move to Philadelphia. He owned major magazines all over the world, including Cosmopolitan, which was the most important opinion journal. He owned his own newsreel service. He had a radio network. He had his own news service that competed with the AP and the UPI. He had a feature service. He had a couple of syndicate services. And he owned his own movie studio, which was a very Cosmopolitan Studios, which was in the beginning of the 20th century a major, major producer of motion pictures.